Okay, well, we're continuing with our Bible lesson times, and right now, for those that are joining here, this is part of our house church service on Sundays, and this is the lesson part of it, which we'll be recording to put out to you so that you can have an opportunity to see this and hear this depending on where you're living and what your opportunities are. And for those of you that have a regular church group and just want to be encouraged by a lesson, we hope this will be encouraging to you also. So, the name of the lesson this week that we're talking about is called The Calling of God. So, in Isaiah chapter 41, verses 2 and 3, Ben, you want to read that?
Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands led nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed by a path his feet have not traveled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last I am He.
Okay. Isaiah here is just talking, is telling the people about the fact that God has always been with those that He loves. That God has His people, and that God, when God is with us, that He's with us right from the beginning, right to the end. And He's just describing, who's the one who stirred things up, who's called Him in righteousness to His service. Who's the one that's protected you and handed over nations when you've gone into war or when you've had problems with other places. He's reminding them of the fact that this relationship that He calls us to, that He calls His people to, that this relationship is a very real relationship, and that it's something that is dear to Him and something that He cherishes and protects. And that when we are part of God's family and we are doing the will of God, that as long as we are in righteous service to God, that He is with us. Well, He's with us always anyway when we belong to Him, but especially during those times, we're going to be unscathed. We're not going to be touched. And if you notice, even later on in the New Testament with Jesus, Jesus suffered and died on the cross. But at the point that He suffered and died on the cross, that was His time. That was His time to suffer. That was His time to die that God had chosen. But previous to that, nobody ever laid a hand on Jesus. No matter how angry they got at Him, no matter how much they threatened to arrest Him or stone Him or do anything else, God never allowed anyone to even touch Him or put a hand on Him in any way. And so it was too later on with the apostles. We know that all of the apostles, except for John, at one point died the death of a martyr. Okay, and there were different times where they were arrested or that they were beaten or whatever. But there were specific times where God, for instance, would say to Paul, I'm going to send you into this city, and you're going to go in there and you're going to proclaim my word, and you're going to do my will, and you're going to do what I've called you to do. And while you're there, I want you to be very bold, and I don't want you to hold back on anything, because I want you to know nobody's going to touch you. Nobody's going to lay a hand on you. I'm not going to let anyone near you. So when God decides that He has something for us to do, and He decides that He wants us to carry this out, there's nothing He's going to protect us completely. And if we do suffer at some point, it's because God has allowed that to happen, to strengthen our character or to inspire the saints later on, like in the case of the apostles who died the death, a martyr's death, and that inspired people for later. But if and when that happens, it only happens if and when God allows it. The point here too is that God called us first. He says, Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? God is the one that calls us. The Bible says that God is the Alpha and the Omega, which is Greek for the first and the last. He's the first and he's the last. He's everything, okay? Which he says at the end of that thing. He said, I am the Lord, with the first of them and with the last, I am he. It's God that created us, and he desires to have a relationship with us as his creation. Isaiah speaks of how from the earliest time God called to us, his creation. He called us to know him and to live in righteous service to him. When we're walking and loving in righteous service to God, we are under his direction and his care. Nations or kings don't mean anything to God. Okay, none of that means anything. A lot of times we can get wrapped up in the things of the world. And we can look out there because there's so much, there's wars, there's rumors of wars, there's people that are suffering and dying every day. There's issues with the economy, there's issues with people being persecuted, there's issues with famine. These are troubles that go on throughout the world. And a lot of times it's very easy to get discouraged by all of that. But the fact is that all of those things, that God is sovereign over all of those things. And in the big picture, all of this life and everything that goes on here is just one very small part of eternal life. That eternal life is much greater than that. And everything that goes on, that God allows to continue to go on, has its purpose. Even though we don't see it, because we don't have the luxury that God has of standing and looking down at everything in perspective, and how that plays out over the next 100 and 1,000 or 10,000 years. We don't have that. God does have that. God knows how everything that happens in this world plays out in terms of the huge picture of eternity. And that's something that he doesn't tell us. What he does tell us is, believe that I am, believe that I love you, and believe that when you trust me and you pursue me, that I'm going to bless your life, and that you're going to see life as it was meant to be. That's what God says to us. And so when we can keep our minds set on that, we can avoid a lot of the anxiousness that naturally happens in our day-to-day life. Because we get anxious about things. We wonder, well, what's going to happen with this? What's going to happen with that? What's going to happen with my school? How am I going to graduate? How am I going to do with this class? If you're a student, am I going to have a boyfriend? Am I going to have a girlfriend? Am I going to get married someday? If you're married, am I being a good husband? Am I being a good wife? Is my marriage going to go well? I have children. How are my children going to do? Am I being a good parent? Are my children going to do well? There are always issues in your life, no matter what stage of living that you're in, that you're going to feel or have the temptation to feel anxious about it, because you want to know. We would like to know now the things that we can't know a lot of times. But there's only one thing that we can be absolutely sure of, and that is that God exists, that he is loving and good, and that when I take one day at a time, and I do the things I do know I should do, and don't worry about what I don't know, just worry about what I do know, and put that into practice and live a loving life of faith, walking with God, that he's going to be with me, and no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. Whatever happens in this earth will be the best that it can be under the circumstances, and even beyond circumstances in often cases with God. And ultimately, where I'm going to be for all eternity is going to be absolute. God is able to carry us, and he's able to be with us always. And that's the promise that he makes to us, that we can draw so much strength from and so much peace from if we can believe it and put into practice that loving walk that he calls us to. God's calling to us has a purpose. Okay, God did not call us for no reason. God calls us to him for a purpose. He gives to us a life that's filled with His love and His goodness. God created life to be lived a certain way. And Jesus said, I came to give you life and give it to the full. When we love God with all our heart, we put our trust in Him and we put into practice the things that He's talking about, it's at that time that we experience life to the full. Because the fullest life that we can live is one that's rich in loving relationships. Loving relationships with God, loving relationships with one another. Now in Mark chapter 10, verse 46 through 52, Julie, you want to read that?
Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, Call him. So they called to the blind man, Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road.
Okay, thanks. I put this example in here because this is kind of an interesting example of a calling. It begins by Bartimaeus, this man who's blind, is calling out to Jesus. Okay? Now Bartimaeus was not calling out to Jesus necessarily because he believed Jesus was the Son of God. Maybe he did believe, maybe he didn't. We don't really know how much he knew about Jesus before this time frame. So it's hard to know what he really believed or didn't with that. The one thing we do know is he wanted to see. He was blind and he wanted to see. And his reason for wanting to connect with God or connect with Jesus was a very practical reason. He wanted to see. And a lot of times when we call out to God, when we first call out to God, a lot of times it's because there's something we want. And a lot of times the thing that we want is not necessarily spiritual. Now sometimes it is. Sometimes we call out to God because we've decided in our mind that Jesus is good and loving and we want to know Him better, and we call out to Him. Say, God, help me to know you better. I want to know you. I want to enter into this relationship. And if that's the way that you first called out to God, that's great. That's a beautiful thing. But many times, oftentimes, when people first call out to God, they don't even know if they believe in God. They don't know anything. All they know is that they've heard this is somebody that has power. This is somebody that can do something for them that nobody else can. And they've run out of options. They don't have any options. You know, there's an old saying in wartime, there's no atheist in a foxhole. You know, put a guy in a foxhole and his bullets flying all over his head. Most of those guys either believe in God or they want to believe in God. Because there's a very good chance at any moment that they could catch one of those bullets, and if there is a God, they're about to meet Him pretty soon. Okay, and they don't want to go in there denying that He exists. So most people in that time, if they're ever going to pray, start praying right there. But there are other reasons people pray. People get sick and they run out of options. The doctors have no way to do anything. They go to God and they pray, God, help me, heal me. You know, blind people pray for their sight. There's always practical reasons like that that a person can call out to God. But the interesting thing here is notice that Jesus called back. Jesus called back to him. And you know, I believe that when we call out to God, God always calls back. God always answers us. He knows our number, so to speak. You know, sometimes you hear that expression, boy, He has your number. Like He really gets what you're all about. Well, God really has our number. He knows what we're about. He knows how to reach us. He knows what we need, a lot of times more than we know what we need. The problem that we have is that we don't always answer Him when He calls. A lot of times God will try to speak to us. God will put people in our lives to help us to understand things. God will put us in, give us opportunities to hear His message, to experience His love and His Spirit around us. He will show us the way to deal with whatever it is that we're calling out to Him with. But a lot of times we don't hear it. And the reason we don't hear it is because maybe what He's showing us is not what we want to hear. That really we're not just asking Him to come and be God. We're asking Him to come and be our slave, to do what we want. We want Him to do what we want. And the thing is that sometimes God will do exactly that. But sometimes God understands our need greater than we do. And what He's showing to us is the way to get to eventually where we want to be. But we're going to have to take it one step at a time and trust in Him. A lot of times we're so busy listening to our own voice that we fail to hear God. We're so busy talking to ourselves in our own head, convincing ourselves of this is how it should be. This is how I think. This is what I think should happen or that should happen. And I'm so wrapped up thinking about what I think and trying to defend my thoughts to myself or to other people that God can't get through to me. It isn't that He's not talking to me. It's not that He's not putting people in my life. It's not that He's not giving me opportunities to connect with Him and to experience a resolution to whatever it is I'm anxious about. The problem is I won't listen. I won't listen and watch and see what He's putting in front of me and respond to it. And if I would just open my eyes and my ears and the eyes of my heart to hear when God is speaking to me, then we would realize that when I pray to Him, He always answers. He always, always answers.